Well, welcome. This looks like a more manageable crowd. I'd start to step last time and I'd step on a little kid. So normally I just kick them, but isn't that what my friend W.C. Fields used to say? Anybody that hates kids and kicks dogs can't be all bad. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about trails and the fort that was here. And I'm going to try to cover normally what I would do in a 3-hour lecture in an hour. So I'm going to talk real fast, so you got to back it up. There were several trails across Colorado when people started migrating into this area. And the one we're going to talk about tonight is the Overland Trail that came through this area. But you had the Santa Fe Trail that came into southern Colorado, southeastern Colorado, and over Raton Pass down to Santa Fe. To the north of us, across what's now Wyoming, you had the Oregon-California Trail. And if some of you are interested in trails, the Oregon-California Trail Association, which is called, the acronym is OCTA, is having their national convention at the ranch in August. And they've got lots of tours and lectures, and so I don't know if you're interested in that, but you might. There will be information on that coming out. We had a thing called the Cherokee Trail that came through this area, that were part Cherokee miners from Georgia who came up from the Santa Fe Trail and went on up to the Oregon-California Trail during the California Gold Rush. And then again, the Overland Trail. And the outbreak of the Civil War altered the main route across Nebraska and Wyoming. And instead of going up the North Platte across central Wyoming and that area up to Fort Laramie, it was routed then up the South Platte River into the Colorado Territory to a little place called Latham, which is east of Greeley. And then it came across the South Platte and then up the Cashlaputa River, and you'll see more of that in the video. But this caused a detour, and this was in the outbreak of the Civil War. Right after that, in 1862, the Native Americans, mostly Northern Cheyenne and Sioux, said, we're going to get rid of these intruders. So they closed the trail, the North Platte Trail, so that's why they diverted it into Colorado. And in order to protect that trail, then, they built a series of forts in the Colorado Territory in northeast Colorado. And they had little handbills that they put out all over, and I was just going to read you just some of this. This is actually, I know you can't see it, but this is what the handbill looked like. And this is the office of the Overland Stage. The Overland Mail between Atchison, Kansas, which is in northeast Kansas, kind of between Kansas City and Omaha would be the easiest way to describe it, to Placerville, California via Denver City, Great Salt Lake City, Carson City, leaves Atchison, Kansas, and Placerville daily, so they were running them both ways, through in 17 to 26 days. You didn't know, say, well, I'll meet you in San Francisco on Sunday, the 4th of July. You couldn't plan that closely. Lots of things that would cause the stagecoaches to be slowed down. The route is stocked with, and here's where they lie a little bit, new and comfortable coaches. Nobody that I know of ever in a journal or anything described these coaches as comfortable. Some of them were new, obviously. And Concord spring wagons, and every attention will be paid to the accommodation of the passenger. Passengers can lay over at any point and resume seats when vacant. So if you gave up your seat, you had to wait till there was another opening coming through. To secure the privilege, they must register their names with the stage agent at the place they lie over. Stations average 13 miles apart, and meals average 60 cents. And some of them were good, and some of them were crap. I think they were flavored with manure. So, but the stations that they're talking about, though, they had what were called home stations and home stations and the little swing stations. And the swing stations were, you couldn't get off. They didn't even really stop. It was just where they'd swing in, unhook the tired team, put a fresh team on, and away they'd go. And those were about every 10 to 12 miles. So when they say stations average 13 miles apart, that puts in those little ones. The home stations averaged 25 to 30 miles apart. And that is where you could get a meal. Each adult passenger is allowed 25 pounds of baggage free, but neither gold dust, bullion, coin, bank, or treasury notes will be carried under the designation of baggage. So you had to pay extra if you had any of those things. Gold dust, bullion, coin, bank, or treasury notes. Extra charges will be made of anything in excess of 25 pounds. And passengers are advised to ship their heavy luggage by way of Panama. This is pre-Panama Canal. So, down to Panama, put them on mules, take them across the isthmus, put them on a ship up to the coast of California. Through fare between Atchison and Placerville, how much do you think? I see a lot of heads going like this. $40. $50. Do I hear 60? Do I hear 75? $200. Okay. How much is it to fly from Denver to San Francisco now if you get a good fare? $79? If you get one of those cheap fares, one way. This is only one way. And railroad fare from New York to Atchison, Kansas was $41, and the fare from Placerville to San Francisco was $10. So those are the things about stagecoach travel by the overland route. So I think we'll do the video. The video runs about 28 minutes.
My brother and I traveled cross country back in the year of 1861. My brother had just been appointed secretary for the government of the territory of Nevada. I decided I was going to go along for the adventure. And my, we had an adventure. We started out in St. Joe, Missouri, and 20 days later we ended up in Carson City, Nevada. Much worse for our wear. But along the way we saw some very interesting things and met some very memorable people. In due time, we rattled up to the stage station and sat down to breakfast with a half-starved, half-civilized company of armed and bearded mountaineers, ranchmen, and station employees. The most gentlemanly appearing, quiet, and affable officer we had yet found along the road in the Overland Company's service was a person who sat at the head of the table at my elbow. Never youth stared and shivered as I did when I heard him call him Slade. Now here was romance, and I was sitting face to face with it, looking upon it and touching it, and hobnobbing with it as it were. Here right by my side was the actual ogre who in fights and brawls in various ways had taken the lives of 26 human beings. All men had lied about him.
Slade died at the end of a hangman's noose in 1864 at Virginia City, Montana. This stagehouse at Virginia Dale provided comfort for the travelers, as can be seen in this account by Silas Seymour, a consulting engineer for the Union Pacific Railroad, who, with General Granville Dodge and 4 others, rode in on horseback in September of 1866.
This is a most beautiful amphitheater, surrounded by mountains, with Dale Creek running through the center. I took the liberty of riding up to the stage ranch and received the gratifying intelligence that the proprietor was prepared and willing to afford both men and beast very comfortable accommodation for the night. We soon found ourselves seated before a cheerful fire, talking over the peculiarities of the country and the incidents of the day.
The visit of this railroad survey party foretold the beginning of the end for the Overland Stage Company and its string of stage stations. Holiday sold out to Wells Fargo and Company in 1866. The Union Pacific's tracks reached the new town of Cheyenne in 1867, leading Wells Fargo to split its line north of Park Station. The new route ran northeast through Burnt Station, Round Butte, and Spotswood Station to Cheyenne. The fledgling town of Fort Collins produced a competing line in 1868, just 1 year after the military post was abandoned. Once the Transcontinental Railroad was joined at Promontory, Utah in 1869, the overland stage became instantly obsolete. Mail contracts were transferred to the railroad, and stage lines were now used for only short hauls. The Virginia Dale station was sold in 1870, about the time William Henry Jackson came through and froze it for all times in this well-known photograph. It became the Virginia Dale Store with an enclosed porch. Later it was given to the Virginia Dale Home Demonstration Club, thus ensuring its preservation as the only intact remnant of those stagecoach days in Larimer County. Some of the Overland Trail continued to be used during horse and buggy days, which stretched into the early part of the 20th century. Some trails were eventually paved and became modern highways. In the early part of the 20th century, the eminent Colorado historian Leroy Hafen, writing in his book, The Overland Mail, 1849 to 1869, wrote a fitting epitaph for the old stage trails. These are the words he penned in 1926, just a scant half-century after the demise of those trails.
Scarcely a railroad line was projected which did not follow a post route, and over most of these roads, stagecoach wheels cut deep the track before trails of steel were laid. More recently has come the motor car, and the old trails were reborn. With more fidelity than the railroads have the automobiles followed the stagecoach routes of other days. The Overland stagecoach is now a symbol of a past era, but in its day it ranked high in service to its generation, and we today may cherish it as a promoter of settlement and as a precursor of railroads into the West.
And here, sitting in the shadow of a modern U.S. highway, is the site of the Cherokee Station. Modern vehicles whiz by at high speeds, unmindful that they are traveling trails blazed by wagons and stagecoaches of a bygone era, the era of the overland stage. In 1864, Colorado 100-day troops camped near Latham. The stages were stopped for several weeks. As nearby settlers became more panicked by exaggerated reports of raids along the trail, they fled to Latham for protection. The presence of the Colorado Volunteer Cavalry led to the nickname Fort Latham. Travelers along the Overland Trail actually had more to fear from outlaws and accidents. The Native Americans were more of a bother than a threat most of the time. On this bleak hill overlooking the South Platte River, a half mile from the site of the Latham Station, is the remains of the Latham Cemetery. A single marker inside this wrought iron fence is dedicated to the memory of a few known burials and several unknowns. One of the burials in this tiny Latham Cemetery is said to be the grave of a young unnamed tenderfoot from Michigan, who was on his way to the Colorado goldfields. While dining at the Latham Station, a fellow passenger who was drunk went berserk and began shooting up the stage station. The young man, in trying to subdue the drunk, was shot and died. He joined a dozen others on this lonely windswept burial site on the bluff above the South Platte River crossing. At Latham, the South Platte could be easily forded most of the year. During high water times, wagons, stagecoaches, and horses had to be ferried across the stream. One ferryman at the South Platte crossing, John Smith, charged $10 per wagon, and there were reports in June of some years of a mile-long line of wagons waiting to be ferried across the river so they could continue on to LaPorte. From Latham, the routes diverged radically. The main stage line crossed the South Platte, headed west up the Cache Lapooter. A secondary route left Latham and continued south up the South Platte River to Denver. This branch made 3 weekly mail trips to Denver until the Foothills route was completed in the fall of 1862. 5 miles above Latham brings us to this spot, Boyd's Crossing. Robert Boyd had settled on the lower Cache Lapooter River in 1860. He built a fort-like home out of sod blocks, complete with gun ports and a corral. From Boyd's Crossing, the next stop for the stagecoach was Halfway House, a swing station located somewhere near the present site of Windsor, halfway between the home stations of Latham and LaPorte. Swing stations were small, usually a 2-man operation housed in either a small log or sod cabin, with a barn and corral completing the site. The swing stations were really nothing more than crude shelters. Mark Twain described one typical station in his book, Roughing It.
You had to bend to get down in the door. In place of a window, there was a square hole just about large enough for a man to crawl through. There was no flooring, but the ground was packed hard. There was no shelves and no cupboards and no closets. In the corner stood an open sack of flour, and nestled against its base was a couple of black, venerable tin coffee pots and a tin teapot. A little bag of salt, a side of bacon. In the corner of the room stood 3 or 4 rifles and muskets with horns and pouches for ammunition. Furniture was neither gorgeous nor much in the way. The sofas and rocking chairs were not present and never had been.
Such were the temporary homes of the hostlers of the Overland stage line. Between Halfway House and the next station, Sherwood's, settler George Robert Strauss built this impressive 2-story square log cabin after he was flooded out of an earlier cabin in June of 1864.
When Bob Strauss lived in the cabin, he had a small vegetable garden, and he would put some of the vegetables out alongside of the Overland Trail, and when the stage drivers came through, they would pick up the vegetables, take them into LaPorte, and sell them for Bob. A few days later, when they came back on a return trip, they would leave money underneath a rock from the sale of the vegetables, and when Strauss had time, he would go out and gather his money. That was one of the ways that he made his living.
Strauss died of exposure after being caught in another flood in 1904. There apparently were 2 swing stations at the Sherwood site at different times. The first was north of the river and the second on the south side.
Only piles of cut stone and charred split logs marked the site of the Sherwood Cabin, built by Jesse and Bill Sherwood in 1860 and used briefly as an Overland stage station in 1862.
In 1863, the Sherwood brothers quitclaimed some of their land on both sides of the river to Ben Holiday. The original stage road stayed on the north side from 1862 until late 1864, since LaPorte was the next stop upriver. Once the Fort Collins military post was occupied in October of 1864, the stage road was moved to the south side of the river, and the second Sherwood station was used for a short period of time. This area of Old Town Fort Collins is the site of the Fort Collins military post. The Overland stage passed through the fort after the fort was built in the late summer of 1864, traveling on what was then called the Denver Road, present-day Jefferson Street. The Sutler Store, called Old Route, contained the post office. Joe Mason served as Fort Collins' first postmaster. The fort, a small outpost, lasted only 2.5 years. It consisted of a dozen log and grout buildings on the south bank of the Cache Lapooter River, on the northeast side of what is now the Old Town Historic District. There were buildings to house both the officers and the enlisted men, a headquarters building, storehouses, stables, and a large parade ground. It provided the basic necessities for the soldiers, but few of the comforts. Wagon trains and freighters continued to use the trail north of the river, preferring only to stop at the supply towns like LaPorte. Home stations like those at Latham, Virginia Dale, LaPorte, and Namaqua were larger structures with accommodations for travelers. Here one could get a hot meal and overnight lodging if needed. Travelers found that the quality of these accommodations could vary a lot from home station to home station. There were home stations every 25 to 30 miles along the trail of the Overland stage line. This small log structure on the banks of Spring Creek west of Fort Collins has been identified through local tradition as the Spring Canyon Swing Station, since its location is just outside the foothills cut with the same name. Little is known about this station, since travelers rarely wrote about these small, nondescript structures where they would literally swing in, change teams, and swing back out onto the stage trail. This building's location is the only clue to its early use. It lies between two home stations, one at LaPorte and the other 12 miles south on the Big Thompson called Namaqua or Mariana's Crossing. The former mountain man and guide from Taos, Mariana Medina, arrived on the banks of the Big Thompson in 1858. Mariana built a tow bridge on the river, though most of the year the river could be easily forded a mile downstream. Today, only these two wooden footings on the south side of the original bridge remain. Situated on the south bank of the river, Mariana Station, often called Namaqua, consisted of a cut stone, fort-like structure complete with gun ports, and three rough-hewn log buildings, one used as his home, another that was a combination store and saloon, and the third lodging quarters for weary travelers. There was also a stable with a stockaded corral. The buildings were arranged Spanish style around three sides of a plaza. Mariana was 46 when he settled on the Big Thompson River. He was a spry and dashing figure who usually dressed in colorfully decorated buckskins. He maintained his station, first as part of Holliday's Foothills route, and later for Wells Fargo until the railroad was completed north to Cheyenne in 1877. The only break in his service came in 1864 when the stage route shifted a few miles to the east to Washburns for several months. Mariana Station became known as Big Thompson Station during its latter years. Here in the shadow of Long's Peak, children play in the Namaqua Park, just a few feet away from the reburied remains of Mariano and his family. Mariana's Butte looms a few miles away, a stark reminder of the site's historic past. In addition to the stagecoaches, freighters and settlers' wagons used the same general route, creating many trails instead of a single road or trail. This has led to a great deal of confusion about the exact Overland Trail, as though it had been a fixed road. The trail was never a single fixed road like those of today. The stage line whipped like an agitated snake from one route to another across the country. When the variables of wagon trains and freighters' wagons are added in, the number of possible trails becomes almost infinite. The routes between the Big Thompson and Casper rivers show this well. The trail changed as the whims of the seasons made certain low-lying sections impassable. As one reporter observed in an 1867 Rocky Mountain News story,
"The lower road via Little Thompson, Camp Collins, etc. has not the advantage in distance as reported. Besides, it runs through a lower and much softer class of soil. The stage tried that route a few years ago and was obliged to abandon it."
By 1867, Ben Holliday had sold out to Wells Fargo and Company. The tracks of the Union Pacific Railroad had now reached into the Dakota Territory, present-day Wyoming. The new town of Cheyenne was being built, and Fort Davy Russell was now quote, permanent post. We're standing on what we believe to be part of the Denver to Cheyenne Road, which Wells Fargo then began building. The road was said to be high and gravelly and had many advantages over the lower road, which ran through the softer soils. The 1867 Rocky Mountain News article seems to be a perfect description of this road. This is LaPorte, site of the next home station north of Big Thompson, and a booming town in the 1860s. When Larimer County was created in 1861, LaPorte got the nod as the county seat, after missing being named the capital of the Colorado Territory by only 2 votes. The Overland Stage Company established a home station here in 1862, the next one upstream from Latham. By the mid-1860s, the town had 4 saloons but only 1 general store and a brewery. After arriving in a wagon train, Johann Heinrich Schmidt wrote in his diary in November of 1866, "I wandered into the village, evidently a very new place. I find there's a German brewery in LaPorte. A couple of Germans whose names I forget are the proprietors. Drank 1 quart of beer for 25 cents paper money." A couple days later, his wagon train forded the partially frozen Poudre River a little ways below the toll bridge. He wrote, "Ice flows in the river, 80 to 100 feet wide, and 1.5 to 2 feet deep. Clear and good water, solid bottom." They continued south, heading for Denver. LaPorte was founded in late 1860 at a good river crossing, and the toll bridge at this site was probably the one operated by early settler John Provo. Provo had a store and hotel on the south side of the river along the present-day road known as Overland Trail. This sign marks the site where Holiday established a home station just north of the bridge in the summer of 1862. William Taylor and his wife were the first station operators. Many travelers commented on their hospitality and good meals. By most accounts, the typical station served food that was unpalatable. LaPorte was blessed with an excellent geographic location. One Overland employee, Frank Ruth, recalled the town setting and its resources.
Its location was rather picturesque when I first saw it in the summer of 1864, nestled, as it was, at the foot of the eastern slope of the Rockies. There appeared to be an abundance of deer and antelope in the foothills, and the Cache La Poudre was alive with trout, little more than a stone's throw from the town.
With the addition of several good farms in the area, obtaining fresh food for the stage station must have been easy. From LaPorte, during the 4-year tenure of the Overland Stage Line, the trail again wandered between there and Virginia Dale. Holiday built the Overland Park Station east of the foothills. This was the first swing station north of LaPorte. Virtually nothing remains of this station, later called simply Park Station. The alternate route went west from LaPorte into the first valley between the foothills. Following the valley north, the next station was Bonner Station. Both routes converged about 12 miles from LaPorte at the swing station known alternately as 10 Mile Station, Stonewall Station, or Cherokee Station. The first name came from its location 10 miles from Virginia Dale, the second for its sheltered site on Stonewall Creek, and the last for the trail's original name, the Cherokee Trail, immortalized by Louis L'Amour in 1982 when he made it the setting for his fictional work, The Cherokee Trail. Standing on this windy ridge called Grayback Hill, we looked down on the lonely sheltered glade which was the site of the station. It was built at this dependable watering spot on the bank of Stonewall Creek. From here, we are looking to the southeast, where the trail topped a steep ridge and made its way down a tortuous rock section of road known as the Devil's Washboard. From there, the trail came across the gently rolling land to a broad draw and then down into this beautiful spot protected by well-watered trees. This was the last swing station in Colorado, 10 miles below the home station at Virginia Dale. Besides 2 or 3 station buildings, this site would have had a corral for 8 to 10 horses. Many travelers made note in their journal of this prominent landmark 2 miles due east of the swing station, Steamboat Rock, or as many called it, Steamboat Butte. As the stagecoach rambled on, the next station north was the home station at Virginia Dale. It was possibly one of the best described stations on the Colorado branch of the Overland stage line. It also had a very colorful history. This station was built in 1862 by workers under the supervision of Joseph A. Jack Slade, who was said to have named the picturesque little glade or dale for his wife Virginia. Slade had a rather checkered career with the Overland Company as a division agent or superintendent. When he was sober, he was efficient, fair-minded, and a hard-working employee. When he drank, he became a much more notorious figure. Mark Twain, traveling by stage in 1861, tells of his trip and of meeting Jack Slade at a home station in central Wyoming.
Now, Christy, this here coach looks a lot like the one that my brother and I traveled cross country in back in the year of 1861. My brother had just been appointed secretary for the government of the territory of Nevada. I decided I was going to go along for the adventure. And my, we had an adventure. We started out in St. Joe, Missouri, and 20 days later we ended up in Carson City, Nevada. Much worse for our wear. But along the way we saw some very interesting things and met some very memorable people. In due time we rattled up to the stage station and sat down to breakfast with a half-starved, half-civilized company of armed and bearded mountaineers, ranchmen, and station employees. The most gentlemanly appearing, quiet, and affable officer we had yet found along the road in the Overland Company's service was a person who sat at the head of the table at my elbow. Never youth stared and shivered as I did when I heard him call him Slade. Now here was romance, and I was sitting face to face with it, looking upon it and touching it, and hobnobbing with it as it were. Here right by my side was the actual ogre who in fights and brawls in various ways had taken the lives of 26 human beings. All men had lied about him.
Slade died at the end of a hangman's noose in 1864 at Virginia City, Montana. This stagehouse at Virginia Dale provided comfort for the travelers, as can be seen in this account by Silas Seymour, a consulting engineer for the Union Pacific Railroad, who, with General Granville Dodge and 4 others, rode in on horseback in September of 1866.
This is a most beautiful amphitheater, surrounded by mountains, with Dale Creek running through the center. I took the liberty of riding up to the stage ranch and received the gratifying intelligence that the proprietor was prepared and willing to afford both men and beast very comfortable accommodation for the night. We soon found ourselves seated before a cheerful fire, talking over the peculiarities of the country and the incidents of the day.
The visit of this railroad survey party foretold the beginning of the end for the Overland Stage Company and its string of stage stations. Holiday sold out to Wells Fargo and Company in 1866. The Union Pacific's tracks reached the new town of Cheyenne in 1867, leading Wells Fargo to split its line north of Park Station. The new route ran northeast through Burnt Station, Round Butte, and Spotswood Station to Cheyenne. The fledgling town of Fort Collins produced a competing line in 1868, just 1 year after the military post was abandoned. Once the Transcontinental Railroad was joined at Promontory, Utah in 1869, the Overland stage became instantly obsolete. Mail contracts were transferred to the railroad, and stage lines were now used for only short hauls. The Virginia Dale station was sold in 1870, about the time William Henry Jackson came through and froze it for all times in this well-known photograph. It became the Virginia Dale Store with an enclosed porch. Later it was given to the Virginia Dale Home Demonstration Club, thus ensuring its preservation as the only intact remnant of those stagecoach days in Larimer County. Some of the Overland Trail continued to be used during horse and buggy days, which stretched into the early part of the 20th century. Some trails were eventually paved and became modern highways. In the early part of the 20th century, the eminent Colorado historian Leroy Hafen, writing in his book, The Overland Mail, 1849 to 1869, wrote a fitting epitaph for the old stage trails. These are the words he penned in 1926, just a scant half-century after the demise of those trails.
Scarcely a railroad line was projected which did not follow a post route, and over most of these roads, stagecoach wheels cut deep the track before trails of steel were laid. More recently has come the motor car, and the old trails were reborn. With more fidelity than the railroads have the automobiles followed the stagecoach routes of other days. The Overland stagecoach is now a symbol of a past era, but in its day it ranked high in service to its generation, and we today may cherish it as a promoter of settlement and as a precursor of railroads into the West.
And here, sitting in the shadow of a modern U.S. highway, is the site of the Cherokee Station. Modern vehicles whiz by at high speeds, unmindful that they are traveling trails blazed by wagons and stagecoaches of a bygone era, the era of the Overland stage.
When the Overland stage came through here, the first thing that was established in 1862 was a small temporary post out west of the town of LaPorte, about across from where Verns is now, in that big field out there. And this was a painting that somebody made, labeled Camp Collins, but the date is wrong. And it actually is a colored painting, the original. But Camp Collins was there from the late summer of 1862, and then in early June of 1864 was a bad winter, lots of snow, lots of late spring snows and rains, and a flood came out of the canyon and totally wiped out the little camp, the military camp. LaPorte was high enough above the river that it just had a little bit of flooding. And there have been other floods in the intervening years that have taken kind of the same course. So, okay, then the word was sent from the temporary Camp Collins after the flood up to Fort Laramie, and this is where the headquarters was for the military out in this area. Colonel Collins, who was the commander up there, had this big command that included basically the Oklahoma Panhandle and all of Wyoming to the Continental Divide and northeast Colorado. And that was his command, and he was in charge of different groups of soldiers that were there. And this is Colonel Collins. And he was from Ohio. He had raised a regiment called the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry. And by all accounts was an outstanding officer and worked very well with the Native Americans and was very popular with the soldiers. And he was the one then that sent the order down and said, find a new location away from the town of LaPorte, away from all those saloons and places where the soldiers could drink. And then when you've done that, he said, start building this new permanent post, as we'll see in just a minute. And this is his restored headquarters up at Fort Laramie. This is the regimental banner for the 11th Ohio. And then this is the guidon that the troops would follow when they were out in the field. And this is in the old Bedlam building up at Fort Laramie. And that's a reproduced copy of a map that supposedly Jim Bridger drew in the sand for him, and then somebody copied it of the whole area. Okay, once the order came down here, Captain Evans was the commander of 2 companies of Ohio Volunteers, and he ordered Lieutenant James Hanna to go down the river with a couple of the soldiers, find a new site. They supposedly ran into Joseph Mason, who had a farm on the north side of the river, and Mason pointed out this site further down across the other side of the river that was high and said, you know, that'd be an ideal spot. And there's one little local anecdote that said they shared some liquor from a black bottle, you know, to help seal this deal. And I was telling that story years ago, and this voice from the back of the room said, "My grandfather didn't drink." And it was Joseph Mason III, Colonel Joe. And I said, "Well, it was probably brandy." He says, "Oh, he drank brandy." Okay, once they found the site, Colonel Collins came down and he wrote out what's called Special Order Number 1, which is what it says here, and it says HDQU, Headquarters, 11th OVC in the field at Camp Collins, Colorado Territory, August 20th, 1864. And that's the birth announcement for Fort Collins. And when we have New West Fest in the summertime, that's, we're celebrating the birth of Fort Collins, though it's kind of, we've forgotten that over the years. And then he says the importance of a permanent post on the Cache la Poudre. And in Army parlance, a camp was temporary, like Camp Carson originally during World War II, and a fort was permanent. So hence the difference in the name. Camp Collins at LaPorte, Fort Collins here. Then he signed it, William O. Collins, Lieutenant Colonel, commanding 11th Regiment OVC and troops on the Overland Mail and Telegraph line in the District of Nebraska west of Julesburg. So if you drew a line kind of through Julesburg, that everything to the west of that, if you drew a line to the north. So an enormous command. He came back down in September, and we think that he brought this gentleman with him, and this was his son Casper. And Casper's the one who Casper, Wyoming is named for. And he came out here about 16 years old with his father. When he turned 17, he joined the Army. He was commissioned a lieutenant. And he was later, there was a battle up at the Platte Bridge Station, which is now where Casper, Wyoming is. And he started leading some soldiers out, and they said, no, there's too many Indians. Turn around, come back, and his horse ran away with him right in the middle of the Indians. When they found him, he had a bunch of arrows in him and was mutilated and killed. So later on, the Post Office Department named the town that grew up there Casper, but they misspelled it. His name was Caspar, and that one is Casper. More like the ghost, Casper the ghost. Anyway, he made this drawing, and the original of this is over at CSU, and this is just the parade ground. The river would be up here, Flagstaff here, 300 by 300 foot parade ground, and then troop barracks and kitchens on either side, and these say built, and these say not built. And they never were built. And then here were the officers' quarters and the headquarters. And again, this one says built, that one says not built, that says not built, that says built. So he was anticipating what was going to be here on this permanent post. Okay. Abraham Lincoln, Norm was just talking about our martyred Civil War president. The request to set aside a great big chunk of land called a military reservation came to him in the late fall of 1864, and he wrote out a little executive order. And this is dated November 14th, 1864. It says, let the tract within described to be set aside for military purposes as a military reservation pursuant of the recommendations of the Secretary of Interior, A. Lincoln. So Lincoln is our town founder in essence.
And where is that document?
Well, that's a good question. because when the fort was abandoned in 1867, over the next 5 years, Congress kept sending these notes to the War Department saying, we want to open up the Fort Collins Military Reservation for to homesteaders, so people can take up the land that they're living on, and the War Department right back say, we don't have any record of it. And that went on for 5 years, and finally the War Department said, we don't have any record of a military reservation called Fort Collins, we don't need it, so give the damn thing away. So, but what happened was Lincoln sent it to the Interior Department, and that's where it got filed, so it would be in the archives in the Interior Department. Okay, this is from part of a drawing, and actually there were 3 drawings made that were identical, and I don't know why 3. They were done by a railroad engineer who was a good technical drawer, but a hell of a portrait and horse drawer. That poor horse is going to get real tired. But this is looking into the parade ground. This was the headquarters building that you'll see in a moment. This was the Sutler Store called Old Grout, and this was one of the officers' buildings. Okay, here's the Sutler Store, the one of the officers' buildings, the flagpole, and then the headquarters building here.
Are any of them standing today?
No. Nothing is still standing, except the Auntie Stone cabin. Okay. And here's the headquarters building. If we kind of take this guy to be about 6 feet tall, that would mean that it's about 15 feet high right here at the ridge line. Didn't have a fireplace? How can you tell that? Yeah, because the chimney's in the middle of the thing. That meant that underneath it was an cast iron stove. Okay. Had glass in the windows. You can see a reflection here. Actually, Norm, I think the next one was close up. You can kind of see the reflection in the glass and so on, like nice fancy work. And they went up, and this overlooked the parade ground. Okay. And then this is the Sutler Store, and because it was made out of a soft cement, which was one of the building materials that they used in the West, if you've been to Fort Laramie, some of the buildings up there are wood, and some of them are this soft cement called grout. Later on, then this got the nickname of Old Grout. But it was the Sutler Store where the soldiers could buy the things that the military didn't provide them with. And after the fort was gone, it became the town's first store, owned by Joseph Mason. They had the first court things up here, church meetings, fraternal meetings, the fraternal organizations. So it was kind of like the community center in those early days. Okay. And then this is Joseph Mason. And he's the guy that recommended the fort site, was appointed post sutler then. And then it was his job to, and he's leaving us. Okay. Mason Street is named for him, and you can hear the train going down Mason Street just a little bit ago. Okay, this is the lady who was invited by Timothy Smith, Dr. Smith, who was the post surgeon. He invited she and her husband Lewis to come up here and to be, she was a very good cook. They had run restaurants in Denver, and asked her if she would come up and cook for the officers, because the officers had to hire somebody to cook for them. The soldiers cooked for each other. You know, they had to take turns cooking. And so she and her husband Lewis were allowed to build a private home on the fort site. And this is a picture that we think was taken probably in the fall of 1866, because there was a photographer here. His name was Fountain Peterson. And his brother, Henry Clay Peterson, eventually became Auntie Stone, or Elizabeth Stone's partner in a number of ventures. And the picture is labeled Dinner at Auntie Stone's Cabin. And this is actually the original back of the cabin that's over here at the museum. And when it was moved in 1873, they took out the windows and the door and the short logs in between and put it on the back of the agricultural hotel as a kitchen. So later when it was moved to the over here to Lincoln Park, they just filled it in with solid logs. So what you're seeing today is actually the back door of the cabin. But this is Elizabeth Stone here, who we think the soldiers nicknamed her Auntie. And she invited her niece, who was a widow also after Lewis died, who was Elizabeth Keyes, and her son Wilbur, 10 years old at the time, to come out here and live with her. So the two cooks, dinner at Auntie Stone's, there they are. There's a couple soldiers in there and some other people. Okay. And the cabin eventually ended up over where the First National Bank parking lot is, was the Pioneer Cabin. The Pioneer Association had meetings and dances and other organizations. There was a kind of like a dance hall built onto the back of it. And they had changed the roof. They'd put the dormer windows on. And so it was really altered quite a bit. And again, this is the original back of the cabin. So the door and the window here would be the back door and back window. Okay. And then here it is at the museum today. Okay. And then here's some more of that drawing. Here's Tripp Barracks over here and over here. And right down, let's see, where is it? It's right down in here. We actually found a date on it years ago. Okay, go ahead. September 22nd, 1866, Will D. Hayes. And Will Hayes was the clerk in the Sutler Store. So he apparently got a hold of one of these drawings, and he went through and labeled it and put numbers on the buildings to tell us what the buildings were. Okay. So here's 16. This would have been a troop barrack. And you can see what one of these looked like in the next picture. Now, how would you like to live in there during these nice, cold, windy days? Had a fireplace in this end and a fireplace in this end. The building is 60 feet long, so if your bunk was back in here, you see how nicely chinked these logs are? It probably got pretty cold. And these are actually soldiers, but a lot of the volunteer soldiers didn't have regular military uniforms. But some of the regular troops that came through, this is Major Otis, who was here with the 21st New York Volunteer Cavalry, and the officers usually were dressed in regular military uniforms. Okay.
Is Otis, Colorado named after him?
I don't think so. I don't know. And then one of the soldiers who was a hospital steward, he was a nurse working for Dr. Smith. He died here of a stomach ache, and he's buried out at Grandview. And it says W.W. Westfall, hospital steward, 13th Missouri Infantry. Well, he was actually with the cavalry. It was called the 13th Missouri Veterans Volunteer Cavalry. But for some reason, when they sent his tombstone, they transferred him to the infantry. So he died here on the fort. Here's another one that died. And the cause of death, let's see, I can't remember where it is. Phil, do you remember where it is in this one? Anyway, he died of the DTs. So he was apparently a heavy drinker. And this is the record that, I can't remember where this came from. Oh, over here. Yeah, there it is. I was looking over here. Delirium treatums? Tremors? Okay. And the post cemetery was right in here, right where the Oak Street Plaza is today. And as the town grew, the beginning of the town, and this was the middle of the town according to the early map. They didn't want a cemetery in the middle of the downtown, so they bought land over at the end of Laurel Street, over at about where Colorado Street is, and that, I can't think of the name of that subdivision now, and moved the bodies, most of them, over there. Yeah, because when they were grading this street in the early 1900s, they found Westfall's grave, and it had a little bottle in it that told who he was and what he died of. That's how we know who he was. And then eventually the town grew that way, so they bought Grandview in 1887 and moved him out to the west. Grandview, 2 words. Right, Phil? Okay. After the fort was abandoned, some of the homes, like one of the officers' buildings, became a private home owned by Frank Stover. So this is Linden Street, and Willow would be right here. And those are all gone. The last one was torn down in 1882. Okay? And then that's what kind of the general layout of the fort looked like, with the river down here, the parade ground, the headquarters building, the old grout, and so on, and then the troop barracks here, and then some warehouses over here, and then the stables over to the east. Because which way does the wind blow here? West to east, so you don't want the stables on the west side. The Civil War was over. The major battles kind of had had taken place. The federal troops were coming back out here and so on. So General William Tecumseh Sherman came through and said, we don't need this fort anymore. We don't need this fort anymore, and ordered them abandoned. So this one was abandoned. Most of the stuff was logs and things, and military supplies were moved up to just outside of where Laramie is today, to Fort Saunders.
Is Fort Laramie where Laramie is?
Nope.
Okay, where is Fort Laramie?
East central Wyoming, over by Torrington. The only thing Laramie and Fort Laramie share is Laramie River.
So Fort Laramie would be east or west of Cheyenne?
North.
Northeast.
North and east.
Okay.
Yeah, it's closer to Scotts Bluff, Nebraska,
Oh.
way over there. So, any other quick questions?
What was the largest number of soldiers that were stationed at the fort at one time?
Good question. Probably the most that were here at one time approached 200. And that was when they were having troubles out to the east. The Indians were raiding and so on. And that's when they talked about when Fort Latham was closed and so on. In the 1866, there were extra troops that were sent up here. And that's how that W.W. Westfall, he was sent up here with a couple of companies from his Missouri Veterans Volunteer Cavalry. And they were just temporarily stationed here before they moved on.
Wayne, during that short period of time with the Indian Wars, they were burning a lot of homesteads. Why didn't they burn the fort down? You know?
Yes. I'll bet you half the people in here can tell you why. When the Indians were raiding and they were burning little homesteads, why didn't they come in and burn down the fort? Not the soldiers. The soldiers had guns. The Indians weren't dumb. They were very intelligent cavalry. They weren't about to come in where there were guns, regardless of what John Wayne movies have shown you. They didn't attack these wall forts with flaming arrows, because most of the forts in the West, first of all, didn't have any walls. There wasn't that many trees. So they were offensive forts. That's right. But you need cannons too, and I don't know if we want to start selling cannons to people to go hunting with. So, yes, young lady.
How far would the stage horses run before being switched out?
Okay, they could go about 10 or 12 miles. That's why when you see, if you see movies, they're wrong, but if you see pictures, or drawings of settlers' wagons, they're either pulled by mules or oxen. Horses aren't durable. Horses just wouldn't last. And so when they had the stagecoaches, they wanted to go in short bursts. So the horses could run at a pretty good gallop for, about 10 miles. I think in between they had to stop and rest them. But then they had to get, switch in, put a fresh team on, go another 10, 12 miles. So that's about as far as a team of horses pulling a stagecoach could go.
Thank you.
Good questions. Is this an assignment for school by any chance? For fourth grade or?
First.
First. Oh.